You need to know RBAC. It stands for Role-Based Access Control. It's one of the three main variants of access control, and it basically defines who can do what in your application, based on its assigned roles. So whether you're building an enterprise-focused application or just a tiny SaaS, knowing access control will greatly simplify your application and improve your security. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use RBAC by managing a fictional organization called eCorp that has three distinct roles. By the end of this video, you'll be able to manage access control like a pro. So if you want to keep your application secure and make your life easier, stick around to learn about RBAC. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a video. Did you know that over 80% of data breaches are caused by stolen or weak credentials? That's why RBAC, or Role-Based Access Control, is an amazing tool to secure your application. At its core, RBAC allows you to assign roles to your users and control what every role can or cannot do. For example, you might want to assign an admin role to a user that needs to manage other users, while limiting their rights to delete some critical data in the application. Or you might assign a guest role to a user that is able to view certain parts of the application while limiting their ability to edit any data. RBAC is one of the three main variants of access control. The other two, as mentioned by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is IBAC, which leads to access control lists, and ABAC, which stands for attribute-based access control. In terms of complexity, RBAC stands right in the middle between IBAC and ABAC. For instance, access control lists are commonly used to protect individual resources, a bit like what we use in S3 buckets. While ABAC are like RBAC on steroids, where you don't assign a user to a specific role with permissions, but where you assign permissions to the users based on their intrinsic properties. For instance, you can use attribute-based access control to restrict when your employees can log into your application based on their time zone where they are. In this video, we're going to focus exclusively on RBAC, but let me know in the comments if you want me to do another video on other methods of authorization. So now let's jump to the code. The code is, as always, in the description of the video below. So the project itself is made of React and NestJs. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with NestJs, I have a course that will help you to get up to speed in no time, link in the description below. So if you want to support the channel, check it out. So the project is a PNPM mono repo. So we have kind of two projects that are shared inside the same GitHub repository. So we have an API here and we have a React application. So the React application is made with vanilla React and Vite. And as I've said, API is made with NestJs. So to be able to use the application, you need to start the API and the React app at the same time. This can be done easily by starting two terminals. So here we go. To start the API, we can use PNPM filter. So here you indicate the app that you want to use. Here we want to use the API app, and we want to run the script start.dev, which comes from the package.json of that specific project. So the backend is now started and all good. And now we can start the React. So same filter React dev, and it's going to run the script dev inside the React folder, right? So our React server is started on localhost 5173. So the project is using Prisma. The database I'm using is SQLite just because it's easier to work with. It's just a file. We have some migrations here and we have a Prisma schema. So in the Prisma schema, it's a very basic application. We have a user model and we have a department model. So pretty much the user can be part of different departments, and we have a many-to-many relationship between departments and users. and this is done by the model user department link. So the link will indicate which role the user has, user, admin or manager, and what kind of title it has in the specific department. So another thing you might notice is the seed script. So the seed script will generate the data, the fake data, and I'm using faker.js for that. The fake data is going to be generated so we can populate the application. So we have a helper function here that creates a user. Basically every user has the same password, so it has been kind of hacked. And what I'm doing in the main script of that seed file is that I first clean the database, so you can run the seed script many times and everything's going to be fine. We first create all the departments, and it's done based on the object here. So here we create the admin, and there will be only one, and as in Mr. Robot we have Terry Colby, who is the admin, and basically the admin will be able to assign roles to users. So he'll be able to promote a user to manager or demote a manager to user. So they all have again the same password, and you can go into more details here. That's not the point. I just want to show how pretty much you can use RBAC in that specific context. We also create a manager, Tyrell Wellick, who will be manager of eCoin department, and we create 100 users who will be kind of randomly assigned to different departments. And that's it. The seed script is run through the package.json here. So it goes inside the Prisma namespace, and if I want to run the seed, I just do npx Prisma db seed inside that specific API folder, so it will regenerate the seed. But for now, I won't do that because I already have all the users generated. I will also go a bit through the kind of basic architecture of the application. So we have the main.ts. We're using sessions. So express sessions to handle login state and logout. Actually, we also have a logout functionality. And we have CORS enabled simply because the React is going to run on another port of the local host. And we need to tell the API that, hey, we actually want to allow the React application to make API calls to the backend. And we also want to pass the credentials. So meaning the set cookie credentials in the headers automatically. Apart from that, nothing really fancy. We have some global pipes for transformation, and that's about it. So in the app module, we just create all those modules that we're using. Here's the access control module that I'm going to come back just in a moment. And you notice that we have a session guard and a AC guard. And the AC guard, access control guard, is actually part of that kind of access control library that I chose to use for this specific project that again I'm going to introduce in a moment. Just be patient. We have the auth module, Prisma module, employee data module, and user module. So the kind of main routes module are those three. So this is just a helper module for handling Prisma. So inside the auth module, and I chose to put everything regarding authorization, authentication inside that module. We have the RBAC policy, we have a strategy, a local strategy. I'm not really a fan of like logging in the user that way because strategy for me is better used for authorization versus authentication. And I think Passport is kind of mixing the two. But or if you are using local strategy, then you are kind of protecting your kind of API with basic authentication, which doesn't really make a lot of sense for me. But anyway, I chose to implement by the book. So we have a login endpoint here. It's using the strategy local, and basically the local strategy is handling the authentication. So it fetches the users, it validates the user. If it doesn't find the user in the database, it throws an error. And by the way, you notice that there's no sign up functionality, just login functionality. And it very naively checks if the user is admin or manager, and then fills pretty much those kind of data inside the request.user object. So that data is available in the request.user object just for pretty much that endpoint. So, and what we do once the login has happened, once the authentication has completed, we assign those kind of values from the request.user to the session, and then we just return a status OK code. And we return a status, okay, we return a JSON just so we don't return a text or null, because on the front end, if you're using a fetch API, if it doesn't return a JSON, you cannot do like response JSON. You need to do response text, and I didn't want to handle those kind of use cases. So I always try to kind of stay consistent and return a JSON here. So that's about it. We also have a logout endpoint, and all it does is just destroys the session. That's about it, and returns a 204 code, and we also kind of return the code here as a JSON. Okay, so let's quickly look at the guards. So I have a session guard. Once user has logged in, he will send the cookie, the session ID in the cookie, and that guard is going to be able to extract the session data based on the session ID that the user sends and save it in request.user. Why? Well, it's because the authentication access control library that we're using needs that. And again, we're going to come back to that in a moment. And we have a roles guard. So roles guard, I said that it's a very simplistic kind of implementation of RBAC. Technically, how it works is that, let's say you have some employee data here, right? Let's say that you have this endpoint that needs to be protected, that needs to be only accessible by, let's say, admins, right? Well, one way is to assign a metadata and say, hey, this is for admins, right? And if you have another endpoint that needs to be assigned to admin and manager, you say, hey, this is for roles of admin and manager. The main problem is that as your application grows, you can have like lots of roles, you can have 20, 30 roles, and you'll be kind of forced to kind of have those big arrays of roles here. So let me show you what that could be. So for instance, roles, and you can have, oh, this should be accessible for admin, this should be accessible for manager, this should be accessible for, like, I don't know, manager too. So instead of doing that, instead of saying which roles can call those endpoints, what we do is that we say which permissions the roles should have to access that endpoint. And since a lot of those roles share the same permissions, we can just say, hey, actually, this endpoint should be accessible for people who can, I don't know, read the managed data, manage employee data, and then it becomes more easy to handle. But of course, if your application is very, very small and you just need to restrict literally some endpoints to be used by the admins, you can use something like that, and that guard pretty much just checks if the required roles as set in metadata match the roles in the session.user array. And that's all I kind of wanted to say, and let's get back to that RBAC that I talked about. So here in this example, I'm using access control. It's a kind of RBAC/ABAC library that I found really, really nice, and the reason is because there's not a lot of options, and let me show you. So first of all, let me start by saying that it's very hard to find a good library on RBAC, very surprisingly. A lot of the libraries are either very old or don't have TypeScript support. It's actually quite crazy. So the first library I kind of came across was RBAC, and RBAC looked like a very good one, but it didn't have TypeScript support, which is a deal breaker for me. So I had to look for something else. Then I found another library called NestJs RBAC, which looked very good as well, but for some reason the documentation was unclear for me, the examples were not very clear, and it seemed to be also an old library. So I kind of didn't want to go that way, and I've ended up by finding access control, which I kind of really liked. And their philosophy is kind of built on the idea of merging the two, RBAC and ABAC, based on the recent NIST papers. So basically what it means is that you define the roles like that and you grant them permissions. So the next thing I have to look for was a library that managed that for NestJS, otherwise I could have implemented that by myself, but it's always better to have a library. And it happened that it exists. It's called Nest Access Control. So that's the library I used. Very grateful for the creator of that library, very easy to use, very well documented. So you basically, in the same way, create roles like that, and you grant them permissions, and you can extend. So there's inheritance, so you can say, hey, the admin should inherit from the manager, but it should not do certain actions. So this is the library I ended up by using. So let's check our RBAC policy here. What I did here is that I say, hey, we have users that have the authorization to read its own kind of employee data, although I didn't really implement that kind of endpoint because its kind of personal employee data are read by me, and me endpoint already knows which user it is calling, and so it will not allow to have an argument or to get something that you don't control, you don't own. So that role is a bit useless here, but basically we have three roles: users, managers, admin. The manager extends from users and the admin extend from manager. And for instance, the manager can read managed employees data, and it can read employee details, and the admin can is extending pretty much from the manager. It can also read employee data, update employee data, and delete employee data, but it cannot read managed employee data, which the manager can read. And it makes sense because the endpoint to read managed employee data should concern only the managers, not the admins, simply because I don't have a necessary logic in it. So it's a very simple way to kind of deny the ability to call a certain endpoint if you don't have a certain role. So if we go back to the employee data, and this is kind of the core of the application, we have the controllers here, and here's my preacher complaining. We can clean that here. And basically here we have a couple of endpoints, and we see that we used use roles that comes from Nest access control. It's just a decorator that will allow to tell which resource it is and which action can be done by this resource. And the possession is pretty much any of our own. Here in this case it's going to be any for everything. So that's pretty much an endpoint for admins, because employee data, the permission to read employee data is only owned by admins. Here's the endpoint for managers, because this permission specifically is only granted to managers. You have employee details, employee data, so you got the idea, right? So basically we protect our endpoint, we protect our application that way. Traditionally, you don't have to use resource-based control. You can go in the logic, you can go in your service and kind of write the logic that way. If it's very simple, that's fine. So for instance, you can first fetch the user by its user ID that is calling the endpoint, and verify if it has for that specific endpoint the necessary permissions. The main problem with that is that well, it creates a lot of spaghetti code, a lot of like repeatable code, because on every endpoint, for instance, you go here, or here we first need to get the user ID. So it will be something like user ID, the user that is calling the endpoint, right? We need to load the user, and then we need to check the permissions, and that should be kind of done for every endpoint to avoid that and to allow to have a more kind of secure application, and that way you don't make all the possible mistakes that you could make in those kind of use cases. We just use RBAC. So here we know that this function is only to be called by, who can call that? By the manager or the admin, but not the user. So if the user will try to call it, he will get a 403 error. So that's kind of the gist of it. So now let's go back to the UI and run the logic. So the UI is here, and we have the sign-in route. We need to enter the credentials. Here I'm going to enter the credentials of, well, let's say of a manager. And I can go for that in the Prisma seed. Let me delete everything that is not relevant here. And the email that we can log in with is tyrell.wellick@ecorp.com. The password is that. And here we go. We have the Tyrell Wellick UI. He can see his employees that he manages, because Tyrell Wellick is the manager of the eCoin department. and he only sees eCoin employees. And that's kind of what the RBAC policy defines. Now he cannot do anything else, so that's a very simple application. But we can now log out, and we can log in as the other guy, the CEO, the Terry Colby at ecorp.com. And Terry Colby, he will be able to see more information. First of all, if we go in the profile section, he'll be able to see all the departments that he is kind of part of, and that is enforced by the many-to-many relationship that we have in the model. So we see that he is admin of all those departments, and because he's admin of all those departments, he can actually have a lot of rights. So he can promote users to another role. So this is a very kind of simple implementation of RBAC. So the RBAC policy here is not stored in a database, it's stored in the code. So all the roles here are predefined in the code. The access control library allows you to store all those roles in a database, but I didn't go that way because that would make the example very, very heavy, because you would need to create all the REST endpoints to modify the permissions. You would need to create the UI. So know that it's possible, and in some cases you will have to do that. It will always depend on your application. If you're building something small where you just want to restrict the access to your endpoints to certain roles that are predefined for like small SaaS or something like that, that would do. But if you want to have something more complex, enterprise focus, where you can assign custom roles, assign custom permissions, there you might use a database to store all those roles. However, if you're really doing something really complex where people can assign custom permissions, in that case it's better to go ahead and use ABAC, which will be much more flexible and granular than RBAC. So if we go back to our UI, we see that we have managers, and I just outlined them in yellow, so you see, and users. So if you click on edit button, for instance, this guy, let's see this guy. This guy is a front-end developer at Bank of E-Network. So I can click on edit and I can promote him to a manager. And once that is done, he is a manager. And if you want, you can log in to the application as that specific user, and all of them has the same password, remember? And you will see that he'll be able to manage, he'll be able to see information of other users that depend on him, because he's now a manager. And in the same way, if I want, as an admin, I can demote him to the role of user, and now he is a user. Let's actually go ahead and log in as a Ralph13 here. Here we go. We can log out, and you see that as a user, as a normal user, you don't have access to anything specifically. You just have access to your own profile data, which is kind of unprotected. So it's the endpoint/me in the user's controller. So yeah, anything can access. So here we don't need to protect that endpoint by resource-based access. But if you try to call anything else that is not that is protected by the RBAC policy, you will not be able to get a good response. So now let's check it out. Terry Colby at ecorp.com. And let's promote that guy now to the manager. Here we go, and log in as that guy. Let me just copy that email because I already forgot the email. Here we go. And now we see that this guy is a manager, right, of that department, and he has access to the data of all the users that are in the same department. Well, that's it for our deep dive into role-based access control. I hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you have any questions or comments on RBAC, or if you'd like to see more of the videos on specific topics, please let me know in the comment section below. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel to see more great content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.